Let me tell you, fellas, this recent podcast has been the most insightful podcast for Destiny 2 Sandbox. This is Firing Range. They've got great content creators like Drewski, Fallout, Cammy, Mercules, cool guy, very analytical guys, the kind of people you want to go to when asking questions about Sandbox. I urge you to go check them out if you're curious to know a little more depth to what's going on inside of Destiny 2 Sandbox, as that's essentially their entire podcast. Now, here recently, they had two key members from Bungie's Sandbox team come on to the podcast, one of them being Kevin Yanes, the ability features lead and Sandbox discipline lead, as well as the weapons future lead, Chris Proctor. Now, a common meme inside of the Destiny 2 community is that Bungie's Sandbox doesn't play the game. And of course, after dealing with like Stasis on launch being as powerful as it was, it's easy to feed into that meme. However, listening to these guys live, like not from a twab, not from a tweet, but listening to them live gave me a lot of comfort. Gave me a lot of comfort in the future of Destiny and the Sandbox's abilities to identify what's happening within their own game. Also, it brought them more in line with us, that Bungie Sandbox developers are players just like us. Today's video, guys, is essentially going through that entire 3-hour podcast and pointing out the juicy, meaty stuff, the stuff that I kind of like grabbed onto as like key informational things. However, there are some things I may have missed, so feel free, guys, feel free to check out this podcast, as the information today is pretty deep, and I'm hoping I'm going to give you enough context for all of these. We're going to talk about future changes that are coming inside of Destiny 2 Sandbox, special ammo, where they sit right now, especially in comparison to primaries, and of course, special ammo economy. We're also going to discuss something that was kind of out of my realm of understanding, which was essentially how aim assist is broken down. And there's actually two components, both auto aim / bullet bending and its magnetism / friction or reticle friction. Interesting stuff, guys. This is probably going to be a very long video, so I'll throw some timestamps up, but let's get started really where this podcast was beginning, which was last Wednesday, and it was right before the Stasis nerfs. That was where all the attention was. And essentially, Bungie stated that the intention of Stasis was to be used defensively. And that's been like the overall goal of Stasis. However, it did come off too hot at launch of Beyond Light, and Sandbox actually fully expected to nerf it 3 or 4 times. Now, I think in the realm right now, we're like on the 3rd nerf, so we could potentially still see another nerf down the line. Like we said in our Stasis videos here recently, that's really dependent on whatever future aspects and fragments we get into the game. Now, they gave us some reassurances because there's a lot of people that think Stasis was way too strong, it broke Crucible, this is just going to happen again when new subclasses come, because of course, the speculation is of a corruption class or a poison-based subclass coming in Witch Queen. They stated that no future subclasses will ever be as strong as Stasis was at launch. Honestly, I can believe them because Stasis was just so damn strong. It was so strong that within a week, they were already issuing nerfs. So just some reassurances for my guys out there that are like, yo, Sandbox, they don't play this game, they don't know what they're doing. Look, I'm not sucking Bungie off right now. I'm just saying, just their candid responses to all of this reassured me. It let me know that they are players of the game. They recognized how strong Stasis was, and they knew very well that it was overtuned. Now, the question comes up, if they knew it was overtuned, why didn't they nerf it to begin with? And from what I got from that was, number one, they had a lot of new players on this Sandbox team testing out Stasis. And number two, they were doing all this remotely. And I remember reading an article last year where they stated that Stasis, or at least all the playtesting that Bungie was doing, was through like Stadia, because of course everybody was quarantined. Stadia is not necessarily a great place to conduct playtesting, right? You got latency issues. Honestly, I can see why Stasis did roll out as strong as it did. I think the primary reason why Stasis rolled out so hot was Bungie was really trying to sell us Beyond Light. It happened in the past with the Taken King. It happened in the past with Forsaken. Every new subclasses that come to this game will be the most dominant subclasses for at least 3 to 6 months after release. Now, moving on to a few other things. The discussion came up about abilities inside of Destiny 2's Crucible, or really in Destiny 2 entirely. And Kevin kind of bounced back and forth, like almost with hypotheticals of a dynamic cooldown system, that instead of having a flat cooldown rate from discipline, strength, and even intellect, instead we could potentially see down the road of a dynamic cooldown system depending on the lethality of that ability or of that super. For instance, a roam roaming super would have a longer cooldown to reach versus a shutdown super like Nova Bomb. And he even brought this up more specifically when talking about abilities such as our neutral game abilities, like a one-hit grenade or a one-hit kill shot, having a much longer cooldown versus some little weak grenade, right? This is interesting because we've never had changing cooldowns depending on the type of grenade or type of ability you're using, and especially supers, right? That's completely a flat stat that's tied to the associated intellect, strength, or discipline. So the fact that Bungie's looking into a dynamic cooldown system, that's huge. That's like Destiny 3 stuff, which was like Bungie's overarching philosophy there with their sandbox team. They want a risk reward with just about everything they bring to the game, whether it's abilities, whether it's supers, whether it's our weapons. Hawkmoon was a great example of that risk reward. Now, the question for a separated sandbox also got brought up. We even brought it up here recently in a video talking about separating fragments and aspects, essentially locking them out to either PvE or to PvP exclusively. However, Bungie's vision here is for a cohesive experience for our Guardians, for both PvE and for PvP. I will say, for the most part, Bungie has done a very good job of separating changes, especially with our Stasis subclasses for PvE and PvP, but there are some fundamental changes that affect both sides of the spectrum. For instance, Cryoclasm, which requires a sprint to activate. That changes the core of that aspect. Speaking of Cryoclasm, Bungie also talked about neutral game abilities and what they're going to be looking toward when making any more movement abilities like Cryoclasm in the future. And essentially, Bungie is going to be leaning away from abilities that can be immediately activated for movement. So take, for instance, Cryoclasm now requiring a sprint to activate. That's kind of the benchmark. That's what they want pretty much for all movement abilities inside of Destiny, which I thought was interesting because this brings up, of course, like Top Tree Dawnblade with Icarus Dash, which they actually stated that Top Tree Dawnblade will most likely see a nerf. And Kevin had some great analogies here, essentially saying that Top Tree Dawnblade, when you break down the different subclasses from like good to anime as hell, Dawnblade's on the top end of that spectrum. Like, it's super anime, which I gotta admit, scooting around with Icarus Dash, I love it. I think this is fine, requiring some level of activation in order to get that major movement. Outside of that, maybe exotics. For instance, Twilight Garrison, right? It locks you into an exotic, but it grants you some level of movement. At the same time, this is just me begging for Twilight Garrison back. Now, speaking of nerfs, another nerf that's going to be looked at later this season is, of course, DMT. Now, DMT actually had a cool origin. Chris actually stated he wanted to make a sniper rifle, but since the weapon was going to be a Tex Mechanica weapon in its theme, they ended up leaning toward the scout rifle, and then, of course, went with the hipfire version of that scout, which I think thematically, DMT is perfect. Like, I can't tell you how much I love this weapon. Yes, it's cheesy inside of PvP for mouse and keyboard users, but it's such a fun weapon to use. Now, the nerf they did mention for DMT will lean more into mouse and keyboard. And again, this is a similar situation to Last Word. Last Word came out. I wasn't that impressed with it because I was still on console and I was using a controller. Then when I shifted over to mouse and keyboard on PC, I saw the light. Last Word was busted. And of course, Bungie kind of reversed that. And now Last Word is feeling much better on controller and actually feeling a little better on mouse and keyboard this season. It's substantially better than its previous versions since the big nerf. But that's essentially what they're leaning toward with DMT. Now let's talk about special weapons and what's on the horizon for them. This was an interesting one because I've seen so many different things happen with special weapons. We've seen special weapons inside of Destiny 1 completely lose ammo when you die and you had to pick up crates for ammo. Then we saw the huge overcorrection with double primaries at Destiny 2 launch. Right now, you could tell Bungie's really trying to tiptoe around this, but they did mention that the special ammo economy right now is too bountiful. So they're looking to deal with special ammo in some way, and it may be something as simple as like scavenger perks don't work for special weapons inside of PvP. Now the question got brought up, why not just buff primary weapons? Which seems to be something that everyone brings up. Bungie actually stated that they want to deal with special weapons first before widely buffing primary weapons. So it seems like special weapons is going to be the first thing they want to touch. If that doesn't work, then they're going to move to primary weapons and giving like blanket buffs to everything. And before people are like, yeah, primary weapons need a buff. Okay, I get it. I like primary weapons, but TTK wise, we have a lot of time to kills in the current game right now for many of our weapons that, although may not be as forgiving as they were in Destiny 1, have actually faster time to kill values than they had had in Destiny 1. And I'm talking like default time to kill values. Plus, we're dealing with different inputs, mouse and keyboard specifically. Personally, I'm interested in seeing how they're gonna deal with special ammo, maybe even some like direct nerfs to certain weapon types, maybe shotguns. And if that doesn't work, then all right, let's see what we can do in the primary department. Speaking of primaries though, it was stated that 120s are still pretty hot. Now, it was not stated that 120s are going to get a nerf. They just said that right now, even after the big nerf, they're still pretty hot. But I just bring it up now because potentially, yes, 120s could get touched just slightly in this season. Now, I know we've been talking a lot about nerfs. Let's talk about some buffs. Bungie's actually looking to tune inside of PvE hand cannons, scout rifles, and machine guns. And they state it reasonably soon. Essentially, guys, this is to counter the precision damage nerf that dropped in Shadowkeep. Now, it was specifically stated this will not be a rollback of that update, but an update to mitigate that nerf. So yeah, guys, hand cannons, scout rifles, and machine guns should be doing more damage inside of PvE reasonably soon. Now, before we get into like really meaty stuff, such as like aim assist, killing when heating up, perks, snipers, there was a discussion that came up about in-air accuracy, and that there is a lot of people that just immediately, once they get a weapon, they just put on an Icarus mod because nobody likes their weapon having piss poor in-air accuracy. Now, Chris made a point that he doesn't like weapons losing any accuracy while airborne. By the way, this is a complete deviation from something like the previous sandbox. Like, I'm thinking of like members of the sandbox from years ago, but I remember, I think it might have been Newski that said that inner accuracy and its overall reduction of accuracy was a design choice, and that's how it's supposed to be. Man, there was a lot of community feedback that was pretty negative toward that statement. So it was nice hearing Chris that he doesn't like that weapons lose accuracy in air. But of course, his concern that there has to be risk reward because airborne play can get pretty tricky. So then they started talking about risk reward systems in this. And the example was brought up, what if you could give up your dodge on your hunter class, but have perfect in-air accuracy, which I thought was pretty interesting. And then they even brought up, what if you had perfect in-air accuracy, but while you're airborne, you have no aim assist, which I thought was so interesting, especially considering we're about to get on the discussion of aim assist here in just a moment. But that risk reward, again, like I stated previously, it's like Bungie's sandbox main goal here, and I like it, which actually takes us to aim assist. Aim assist, we know it makes our weapons feel good, right? And it's actually broken up into two different components. The first component being something called auto aim, as Bungie calls it, or bullet bending. The second component being magnetism, which actually literally slows your reticle down, also known as reticle friction or reticle stickiness. Now, the range stat does play a major role in this, as it determines when damage fall off actually begins. So you can have a weapon with max aim assist, but if its range is piss poor, it won't be sticky, at least at its damage fall off range, which would be sooner. Now, it was also stated that the higher the aim assist, this actually affects the cone angle. And cones have been brought up a lot in the past, but there's multiple cones at play. The aim assist cone and the accuracy cone. Now, accuracy, this is different from aim assist. And you actually have starting accuracy and final accuracy. And of course, this is referred to as bloom. Is it present in the game? Yes, to a certain degree. But of course, there are certain perks, and they brought up accuracy because certain perks in the game directly affect accuracy, and it's stated in the perk itself. Take opening shot, take tap the trigger, take tunnel vision, heating up. You've got certain perks that even have accuracy in them, and if you look at bows themselves have an accuracy stat. So this is a stat that we don't really talk about. We can't really even see it, but it definitely plays a role alongside aim assist. Now, what was interesting was when they started talking about mouse and keyboard, as it was stated that the first part of aim assist, which consisted of that auto aim, that bullet bending, is the same for both mouse and keyboard as well as controller. But bullet magnetism itself, that reticle stickiness, that friction, is only present on controller. But the accuracy cone is present on both, but actually effectively higher on mouse and keyboard. Essentially, your shots go where you're aiming. Now, they stated that this is by a margin of 20%. This was previously 40% pre-season 13. I remember when these changes actually rolled out, but all of this is essentially why weapons inside of Destiny 2 feel so unique. It's this combination of that auto aim, bullet bending, and the magnetism / reticle stickiness. Now, they branched off a little more into zoom because all of this is tied together. And I know we're really getting deep here, guys, sense. But for somebody like me that does a lot of weapon reviews, this was incredibly insightful. We know that zoom affects damage fall off, but it also affects your auto aim, your magnetism, those two components of aim assist. Zoom affects all of those things, which makes your overall aim stickier at greater ranges. Now, they mentioned this is just at greater ranges, so beyond the point of damage fall off. So by all accounts, zoom mainly just increases your range, which we already knew. And of course, auto aim and magnetism are technically shifted to those levels because of your zoom. Now, the discussion came up about snipers, as snipers are directly tied to zoom now. The higher the zoom, the more you should hit your shots, right? What was interesting was when they brought up the aim assist value for sniper rifles. Say, for instance, if you were sitting at 0 aim assist, your aim assist cone would be at 0.825 degrees. And at 100 aim assist, that would effectively jump up to 1.375. Now, this is before zoom is even considered. A 60 zoom sniper will actually reach the aim assist cone cap, which widens that cone by 20%. So this is important for a lot of reasons. Number one, aim assist is obviously important for sniper rifles, no matter what, but zoom also being a secondary stat that feeds into that cone, allowing you to hit shots with more ease. Of course, the drawback with too much zoom on a sniper rifle is, well, you're very zoomy. So hitting your shots, at least mid-range to short range, is very difficult to pull off. Now, a point of reference came up for hand cannons, which I thought was really interesting. Hand cannons are actually the most forgiving weapon in the game in its aim assist cone. And that's essentially because at 0 aim assist, hand cannons sit at 2.5 degrees, and at 100, it goes all the way up to 3 degrees. This is substantial considering we just talked about sniper rifles being at 1.375. So I bring that up as like a point of reference there, hence why hand cannons, I don't know about you guys, even myself on mouse and keyboard, I shoot shots and I'm like, wow, that's a headshot? Okay. Now the discussion came up for aim assist on shotguns. Now shotguns have gone through a couple different evolutions. Used to, the aim assist on shotguns would pull the barrel toward the head of a target, and of course the head of a target is smaller than their body, so a lot of your pellets would just miss. It was a number of sandbox changes ago though, but essentially the barrel of your shotgun, the aim assist value that is affecting that will pull the barrel toward the chest of your opponent. But what was so interesting is the aim assist value only affects that barrel and reticle pull, but not actually the pellets themselves. They're independent, meaning the pellets for your shotgun can of course still miss. And of course slug shotguns is a different animal. Now they got into the discussion of barrels that affect your pellet spread. We've got smooth bore, which flares it out, and full choke, which dials it in. These are currently the only 2 shotgun barrels in the game that can affect pellet spread. Now, Chris did mention that there was one other shotgun barrel that actually affected damage fall off, and I want to say he also said pellet spread. His mic kind of like cut in and out, but he said it was extended barrel on the Ikelos shotgun. Now, is extended barrel meta? It's hard to say. Ikelos is the only one I believe that can roll with extended barrel. When I go look for other shotguns, they don't roll with extended barrel. But keep this in mind, if you happen to see a shotgun in the future that has extended barrel, well then perhaps it is meta. Now some other things in regards to aim assist and accuracy, one of them being the perks tunnel vision. Tunnel vision, which requires a kill activation plus reload, gives you plus 20 aim assist, also plus 20 accuracy, and it bumps your cone multiplier toward your auto aim and magnetism. So essentially everything across the board. Tunnel vision, we already knew it was S tier, but these are just like definitive numbers. Now heating up is another S tier trait now, where essentially requires kill activation, and it gives you 15 accuracy per stack. Now Chris even brought up Killing Wind, as that's like the first perk I think he said he made. Killing Wind gives you plus 20 mobility. It also has faster ADS speed than moving target and lightweight weapons, as well as bumps there in handling and range. A lot of people like Killing Wind. I think it's pretty good, especially for game modes like Rumble, where you're just going from target to target. But what was interesting was when they brought up Killing Wind and Elemental Capacitor for Stasis users. So Killing Wind already buffs your ADS speed as well as your strafe speed, your movement speed. Elemental Capacitor for Stasis users boosts your strafe speed as well. These things do stack, and there's a few weapons that roll with both Killing Wind and Elemental Capacitor, one of them being Stochastic Variable, which we actually have one of. Terrible zoom though, so I don't know if I'm going to use it, but wicked trait combination. Now another perk they brought up was one that I've always wondered about, and that is of course Zen Moment. Zen Moment, which actually is supposed to give you stability stability as you deal damage to your target. He was actually the precursor to rapid hit. Interestingly, doesn't actually buff stability. Instead, it reduces the maximum number of recoil per hit and stacks up to ×5. Now, this is different from recoil direction. It has nothing to do with that. It's simply reducing the maximum deflection of your weapon, which is similar to stability, but it limits how much recoil your weapon maxes out at, which is why Zim Moment for most mouse and keyboard users has been useless. As recoil for most mouse and keyboard users, it's dialed back much more than for controller users. So the point I'm trying to make is this was confirmation of what so many people have been saying now for years, is that Zim Moment is worthless on mouse and keyboard. And even when we talk about Zim Moment, a lot of times when I give recommendations about Zim, it's for controller users. So it's nice to get that bit of information. They didn't bring up rapid hit, but rapid hit actually feels like it does something even for mouse and keyboard. So I want to say rapid hit still ties directly into stability, which would be noticeable even for mouse and keyboard users. Speaking of stability, a weapon type that should be focused more on the stability stat is, of course, fusion rifles. Now, fusion rifles in the past, there's been like a tightrope between both of these, both stability and range. I've kind of leaned more toward range for mouse and keyboard, but here recently, I have been leaning back towards stability. And that was like the thing back in D1. You had to have stability simply because it didn't matter if you didn't have damage fall off. If your bolts had too much spread in them and you couldn't land them, you're dead anyways. We're kind of right back to that same formula. So guys, keep that in mind. Fusion rifles, stability, very important. Now, speaking of fusion rifles, Vex Mythoclast was also brought up. And I don't know how you feel about Vex Mythoclast, but there is a lot of people that think the weapon is underwhelming considering it's the raid exotic. So they did state, or at least Chris stated, that a potential buff will be coming to Vex in the future, as it's not landing as strong as Bungie had hoped. Also, Bungie Sandbox team does love Telesto, which you would think would be the opposite since Telesto breaks so much, but it's like one of those love-hate relationships that they've just learned to love Telesto for its brokenness. Now, some miscellaneous notes that I have here from the podcast. The subject of flinch got brought up, and essentially how flinch works. And you've seen it before, where players could be coming around a corner and be aiming in the general direction of the target, and then when they get shot, their reticle would jump on their opponent's face. Now, Bungie brought up that flinch is supposed to reward tactical play. It's supposed to reward the person who gets the first shot off. And even though people have brought up, we'll just completely remove flinch, Chris stated you can't take it away unless you replace it with something. And that something would be like de-scoping, where upon immediately taking damage, you de-scope. You go straight into hip fire. If I got any Halo players in here, you know what we're talking about. But those are your two options, flinch or de-scope. I think I'm cool with just flinch. Now, unflinching mods, which greatly combats this, do stack. And actually, double stacking unflinching mods is the equivalent of no distractions. And then if you wanted to take that a step further, unflinching mods also stack with no distractions. So if you don't want flinch in your life, start double stacking unflinching mods. They work, guys. Now, some other things that Bungie acknowledge, the Quickswap Glitch will be looked at some point, as this undermines the quick draw nerf, which I understand when you look at it that way, it kind of does. Now, quick draw got a nerf, and they actually said it was a successful nerf, as they really wanted to target quick draw on all weapons, not just shotguns. I know that was like the one that really popped up, Fell Winners, Astral, but they wanted to target quick draw on things like primary weapons. And I brought this up. That was where you were going to feel it the most, on things like Igneous Hammer, 120s. When you've got a trait that immediately maxes out your handling with no requirement other than just loading it out, that undermines a lot of other traits. It undermines surplus. It undermines whole archetypes. Like, what's the reason for running lightweight if you can just run quick draw? Now, granted, of course, you still get the mobility bump from lightweight, but you see where there's like conflict there between how quick draw was before and other traits in the game. High impact pulse rifles, for instance. I love high impacts with quick draw. Those weapons feel sluggish. Quick draw maxed it out. Needless to say, Quickswap Glitch, which allows you to bypass and immediately draw your weapon out, will be getting looked at and potentially a nerf. Now, one last thing that was also not really brought up, but like said in passing, was that the identity of light subclasses and their current nodes will most likely remain unchanged. Now, I don't know if this necessarily means remain unchanged in its theme or remain unchanged like completely. Will we still have the same light subclass nodes forever and ever? Or does this mean that when it does migrate to the Stasis layout that we currently have, will Bungie try to retain the identity of those subclasses, meaning what a gunslinger is supposed to be? And I've seen this from like Luke Smith in his comments about Nova Warp not being IP defining. We meme on it a bunch. But the identity, I would say, of that class, of Void Walker, is around Nova Bomb. And Kevin even brought up that Gunslinger, the identity of Gunslinger should be around gun skill, the actual gun, the golden gun. And of course, Blade Barrage and Burning Knives kind of conflicts with that identity. Long story short, I don't think this is something that's going to happen anytime soon, but if there is a migration from our light subclasses and their current layout to Stasis subclasses and their current layout, we will probably see certain subclasses get dropped under the subject of class identity, which for my few people that are still maining Nova Warp and Blade Barrage, well, obviously that's the identity that you see on that class. And of course, we start hitting some gray area because it's like Stormcaller. How do you identify with Stormcaller? Mean Beam? Chaos Reach? Say what we want to say. Yes, it's busted, but it's also pretty dang awesome. And I would actually pass up both Stormcaller supers to keep Chaos Reach, despite it being pretty busted inside of PvP. Same with Code of the Missile. Code of the Missile, super awesome super. Would I pass up both of the Striker supers to still keep my Yeet super? Yes, absolutely. So again, this identity conflict, considering that Kevin brought it up in passing, and of course Luke brought it up in that article a few months ago, this is something that Bungie's really considering, guys. Like I do think at some point we will migrate to that and thus lose some supers and subclasses. And it's just going to come down to Bungie and what they decide to leave behind. So fellas, that was our breakdown of that wonderful, wonderful podcast. Again, guys, go check them out. Great content creators. Wonderful that they had the Sandbox team on there. Wonderful that we got to hear from the Sandbox team themselves. Because again, we kind of fall into that meme that Bungie Sandbox doesn't play their game, especially when we're playing with broken stuff. This gave me a lot of confidence. Both Kevin Yanes, Chris Proctor, both of them play this game. And I love like Chris was like just pulling numbers out of thin air. These gents know their stuff. And it was great to hear all their answers live. Well, fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching. And as always,
slap that like button like your mama told you right.